Welcome to Freethinking 101. I'm Pat Inniss, and tonight's topic will be African Americans for Humanism. Helping us discuss this interesting area is our guest, the former president of the Rationalist Society and the product of billions of years of evolution, Steve Best.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Welcome to the show, Steve. I understand that the African Americans for Humanism has been covered fairly extensively in Free Inquiry magazine. You've got some articles out of there you're going to discuss with us. Could you tell us, I guess, first of all, a little bit about Free Inquiry?
Yeah. Free Inquiry is published quarterly by the Council for Democratic and Secular Humanism, also known as CODESH. The three articles were in the spring 1990 issue, and they related to African Americans and humanism. And I'd like to just bring out some highlights of some of these articles. The first article is titled, "How Much Influence Can Humanism Have on Blacks?" It's by Norm Allen Jr., and he's the executive director of the African Americans for Humanism. He starts out by talking about many polls that have been conducted that have found the influence on American youth of the church to be at or near the bottom. And listed above that are school, family, television, and peer pressure. Yet, he says, 90% of Americans state that they never doubted the existence of God. There seems to be a little bit of a contradiction there. The Baptist Church, for example, has many African American members, and this may increase as a high percentage of the members that they do have are under the age of 30. Islam has become increasingly popular among African Americans also, and Norm Allen lists some of the influential leaders in Islam that have some appeal to Afro-Americans.
Now, those would be, well, what are you referring to? Farrakhan is one of the people there?
Farrakhan is one, and I think a lot of people that know about Farrakhan have a sort of a negative view of him, but among African Americans, they don't have this unanimous negative view.
Well, you have to sort of wonder why, because here we're talking about a guy that, well, he believes that the white race was created by a mad scientist, and I guess the latest thing that's come out is that now he believes he's been taken aboard a flying saucer. Mm-hmm. So you have to wonder about the quality of the leadership in that instance at least.
Another thing he's asking for is that they build an Islamic nation here in the United States. The Muslim psychologist Naim Akbar is another one. He's very much in demand as a speaker. And Valencia Mohammed was pointed out by the writer as an important person. She's an African-American Muslim who heads a movement in Washington, D.C., an organization called Operation Know Thyself, which encourages the D.C. schools to revise the school curriculum to focus on subjects relevant to African Americans. Now, I think she's not the only one that's encouraging this, and people who are into the school issue or the school scene understand this to be true, and this has been the last, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, well, before that, I'm sure.
Yeah. There are now 5 million Muslims in the U.S., and this is expected to triple by the year 2020. There's sort of a little contradiction in the writing here, too, because he downplayed the influence of the church, and then he cites all the increase in that's going on among the African Americans.
Well, also I might add that some studies have shown that among African Americans, although the nature of their religion, they're more profoundly, that community tends to be more profoundly religious, perhaps, than a lot of other segments of society. Now, you have to contrast that against the high incidence of teenage pregnancies, of crime, of alcoholism, and drug abuse in the African American community. And once you see the evidence, that's very strong evidence that the fact that the church religion really isn't doing the job in terms of providing any solutions to these problems.
Or it may have a different job that it's performing.
Well,
and I think the second author I'll be getting to will have something to say about that. He points out there is much confusion among African Americans about the role of religion, and this is partly what you're saying. Many people are searching for meaning in their lives, and religion has been unable to fulfill that need. African Americans who are not religious often feel as though they are alone among others of their ethnic heritage. An organized humanist movement can fill a void in the African American community if it is relevant to African American culture and history, our writer believes. Humanistic ideals can be very influential if they are espoused by a dynamic, unified, rational, competent, intelligent, well-organized minority. I don't know how many minorities we find that fit all those categories, but I think that's probably true. Humanism has always been influential in the African American struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. And Norm Allen cites, traditionally, humanists have been heavily involved in every major movement geared toward uplifting African Americans in society, and he cites Thomas Paine and Robert Ingersoll as exemplary. Now, those are certainly not African American individuals, but they were in the forefront of humanist circles that were espousing those rights. Mr. Allen cites many humanist interests and values that coincide with African American needs, interests, and values. A strong belief in life and humanity, the idea that science and technology are important tools for the development of society, critical thinking as instrumental in helping African Americans to choose the best strategies for change, a commitment to an open and pluralistic democratic society, and the eradication of racism and intolerance, the separation of church and state, and, in opposition to negative theologies, humanism offers hope, optimism, and a passion for life. He sounds like he's the executive director of this organization, doesn't he? In addition, the humanistic values that would be most beneficial to African Americans and humanity in general are altruism and individual responsibility. Norm Allen concludes, quote, "We need not promise humanity a utopia, but in the words of Thomas Paine, we live to improve or we live in vain." Unquote. That's very good. A somewhat less optimistic view is that of Ishmael Jaffrey in his article, The Quest for Humanist Values. In 1982, he filed a complaint to keep prayer and other religious activities out of the public schools of Mobile, Alabama. As a lawyer and an agnostic, he was seeking to keep public officials from making decisions about his children's spiritual upbringing, as well as seeking to maintain the integrity of the Constitution. In 1983, Judge W. Brevard Hand in the U.S. District Court ruled against Ishmael Jeffrey, but on appeal in 1985, the Supreme Court characterized Judge Hand's ruling, quote, "a remarkable deviation from principles firmly embedded in our constitutional jurisprudence," unquote. The case set off a national controversy about the nature of secular humanism and the separation of church and state. Now, between the two decisions of 1983, when he was rejected, and 1985, when he won, Mr. Joffrey encountered hostility in the African American community, and particularly from churches. He said that I would file this kind of lawsuit was an embarrassment to the African American community, which expected me to be a, quote, good Christian, unquote.
Well, you know, that's really not too much different from other people's experience, especially in certain rural areas where people have been under tremendous pressure to quite often you find that that religion gains a foothold in schools, in public schools in rural areas.
Yeah.
And of course, the person that does raise some type of challenge to this infringement of constitutional rights is quite often pilloried by the fellow residents of the area. So there's a lot of social pressure there.
That's true.
I might interject also, though, it's kind of coincidental that another African American was involved in a somewhat similar suit involving the symbol of Zion, Illinois, which contained the cross, and of course he was instrumental in the court decision in that case.
Mm-hmm. At any rate, Mr. Joffrey was threatened, slandered, and vilified by mail and phone and on radio talk shows in the city. This subsided somewhat after the favorable 1985 decision. He points out that African Americans, as a group, are among the most religious people in the world. Religion offers the hope of reward in the hereafter through the realities of the present may seem, or though the realities of the present may seem like living hell. Many of our people, he says, have little hope that our lives on earth will improve, and for some of us, religion acts as an opiate. So as you said earlier, there really is, it does seem to serve a purpose. He says we African Americans are among the most repressed people, and religion helps us to cope with the everyday struggles of living.
Yeah. Well, you know, one thing you might observe in studying really the influence of the African American community, or the influence of the church in the African American community is, you can trace the history back to a time when there really wasn't a lot of options for African Americans, particularly in slavery. Religious institutions was really one of the few outlets that black people had at that time. So you can sort of expect that the churches might have become very popular and very important social institutions within the black community. Of course, African Americans have been excluded from a lot of other realms of life in this society. So the churches have really remained very popular and forceful, influential institutions, more so than perhaps in the white community, where there are a lot more options for a person to develop.
You can see where this sort of contrasts with the first author who sort of downplayed the influence of religion. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe there's a difference between the religion being a source of real positive things in a person's life and it being the opiate that has been mentioned. It can be different. An additional thing Mr. Jaffrey points out is that the early heritage of African Americans, many before they were brought to the United States, focused very much on the supernatural, which may contribute to the feeling that religion is the one thing that can give someone hope, that their miserable lives will improve in the future. Ishmael Jaffrey concludes by hoping that African Americans will become less fragile and would not need to rely on a hope for deity to make their lives better. Instead, relying on ourselves and ceasing to rely on being followers of charismatic leaders who have their own agendas.
Yeah.
And he goes on, it's his wish that people would analyze things in a logical, rational way and make logical, rational decisions based on observations. He extols the scientific method of inquiry. He concludes, quote, "To the extent that I can, I encourage people to think for themselves and not allow others to do their thinking for them. And to my dying breath, I shall always attempt to do just that." Now that sounds to me very much like what freethinkers hope for.
Exactly. Well, I guess when you're looking at it from an African American perspective, as a free-thinking African American, you can see quite plainly that one of the effects of the position of African Americans in this country has been for them to assume almost a siege mentality, where they feel very reticent to criticize any of their primary institutions, such as the church, or their leadership. They're very protective of their leadership and of the institutions such as the church. So when somebody comes out and takes some action in opposition to religious belief, which is very important and which has helped, they feel, tide them over a lot of hard times, there's a certain amount of hostility just as when African American leaders have been attacked or criticized, at least, oftentimes very fairly, there's been a very strong reaction by African Americans that, well, you shouldn't turn against your own. This is an African American leader. We have to support these people, whether they're implied, whether they're right or wrong.
That reminds me of a column in the Post-Dispatch today. I don't recall the columnist, but he was speaking to exactly that issue. The mayor of Washington, D.C., they had a sting operation, and that resulted in a trial and so on. And the black community, almost to a person, supported him. And when he was let go with a very minor punishment, why, they celebrated. And then they were saying the sting operation was a white effort to get him. Now, when you contrast that with Missouri, where they got several members of the legislature recently through sting operations, you don't hear groups of blacks saying that, oh, that's unfair and so on. So the content of that article, and you ought to read it, it's a very good one, was that there seems to be a double standard in that respect.
I don't argue that. Really, I think there is some tendency for the prosecution of black people to be, in those situations, to sometimes be a little bit more enthusiastic than you might expect. I don't doubt that that might be the case, but the fact remains that these people are quite often guilty of certain crimes, and that has to be. But the interesting thing in the Washington D.C. case is, although many people were vociferously defending Mayor Berry, his successor now, the Democratic candidate, was the one candidate that came out to be very critical of Mayor Berry and said that she would reverse all the damage that he did and get rid of all his people and really turn the city around. And of course, she carried the day at the polls. So I think a lot of people, when they get into the privacy of the polling booth, away from their peers, are really recognizing what the need is and the need for effective black leadership. Yeah,
that's to be hoped for, certainly. Yes. The third article, and I'll sort of summarize it, it's an African American Humanist Declaration. It's a declaration for humanism, as it indicated. Norm Allen Jr., the author of the first article I talked about, is executive director of the organization, and Ishmael Jeffrey, the second author of the second article, is on the advisory board. So these two gentlemen are very much involved. Anyway, they list some ethical principles in the declaration. I'll just read those, because it summarizes a lot of what they have in mind. A commitment to the application of reason and science to the understanding of the universe and to the solving of human problems. A concern with securing justice and fairness in society and with eliminating discrimination and intolerance. A belief in enjoying life here and now and in developing humanity's creative talents to their fullest. A belief in the cultivation of moral excellence, skepticism toward untested claims to knowledge, openness toward new ideas, a belief in optimism rather than pessimism, hope rather than despair, learning in the place of dogma, truth instead of ignorance, joy rather than guilt or sin, tolerance in the place of fear, love instead of hatred, compassion over selfishness, beauty instead of ugliness, and reason rather than blind faith or irrationality. I think those are things we could all
some of them sort of verge a little bit on motherhood and apple pie.
Yeah, but, I think they're all good.
Yeah.
Now, they have, in addition, organizational aims, and I'll get to those. And then if we have time, I think there are a few things you wanted to bring up.
Well, I might interject right now some of the people that the African Americans for Humanism list as very prominent humanists. Langston Hughes, the poet, of course, is in those ranks. And then you have Paul Robeson, you know, the actor and singer, athlete, all-around
Yeah.
Renaissance man. Zora Neale Hurston, an author and an ethnologist, I guess you could call her, an anthropologist of sorts. J.A. Rogers, an anthropologist. W.E.B. Du Bois, historian, sociologist, writer, civil rights leader. Hubert H. Harrison, very famous writer and public speaker. Carter Woodson, who's a historian and a founder of Negro History Week, Black History Week nowadays. Lorraine Hansberry, she's an author and a playwright. Richard Wright, an author, native son. And author Schomburg, the historian and biographer, I guess, bibliographer. There's a Schomburg Museum, isn't there, in New York, I think, a very interesting place. So all those people are part of the African-American humanist community, and quite a distinguished list they are.
It sounds very distinguished. I recognize some of them. Anyway, I'll quickly run through these, and you may have something else you want to say. The organizational aims include fight against racism in every form, incorporate an Afrocentric outlook into a broader world perspective, and that's needed. Add depth and breadth to the study of history by acknowledging the great contributions made by people of African descent to the world, with the purpose of building self-esteem among African Americans and helping to demonstrate the importance of all peoples to the development of world civilization. Develop eupraxiphy, or wisdom and good conduct through living, in the African American community by using the scientific and rational methods of inquiry. Solve many of the problems that confront African Americans through education and self-reliance, thereby affirming that autonomy and freedom of choice are basic human rights. Develop self-help groups and engage in any humane and rational activity designed to develop the African American community. And finally, emphasize the central importance of education at all levels, including humanistic moral education, developing a humanistic outlook, and providing the tools for the development of critical reason, self-improvement, and career training.
That's very good. You know, it's interesting to, when you look at an organization like the African Americans for Humanism and try to figure, well, where does this organization fit in? What's the purpose of this? But there are a lot of very unique things about the African American culture that humanism can address. And one of the things is that there's, I guess, a temptation for African Americans to react to the racism that they see in Western culture and in turn sort of react to that by modeling another form of racism, which it really mirrors what you see the white people inflicting upon the black community. In a sense, this is what you have with guys like Farrakhan, okay, who have really emulated. It's sort of the psychological phenomenon where you have imitation, where the oppressed people imitate the oppressor, like the people in the concentration camps, Jewish concentration camps, make themselves swastikas and armbands and walk around like Nazis, where it's one way of relieving psychological pressure is to in some way identify with your oppressor and even sometimes pretend to be your oppressor. And you can think that something like this may be at work when you compare some of the very extreme black Muslim politics to maybe the Nazi politics or Ku Klux Klan, and there's sort of a symmetry there where if you look at humanism, it allows you to take a middle of the road path and break away from any forms of racism like that. But one thing I would like to mention is the African American humanists have called for the establishment of a monument of the unknown slave, and this is they've established a commission to look into ways to raise funds for this project and initiate a national contest for architects and artists to design the memorial, and also work for the enactment of a congressional resolution authorizing placement of the monument. They're thinking right now that this would be in Washington, D.C. The idea is that, 1990 we have the 125th anniversary of the actual emancipation of the slaves in the United States. And there's
Yeah.
really nothing that marks effectively the contribution that has been made by slaves. I mean, slaves fought in all the wars. They built a considerable amount of the country. They contributed to the advancement of science and commerce in the United States without really any effective recognition of their
Yeah.
work. I mean, there's monuments to the Vietnam Memorial, the Memorial to the Unknown Soldier.
Yeah.
But I think you can really travel across the country and you're not going to really see anything that memorializes or even recognizes the dues that are due the slaves that performed
Right.
such valuable service.
Which was not an insignificant part of the population.
Right, right. So they think that this would really have a humanizing effect and help people appreciate the role that slaves played, role that slaves played, shall I say,
Right.
in the development of the country, although often unwillingly. If you wanted to contact this group, you could write to the Monument to the Unknown Slave, P.O. Box 664, Amherst, New York 14226-0664. And if you didn't get all that, you can always write to the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. I'll give you our address. We're the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. We can be reached at P.O. Box 2931, St. Louis, Missouri 63130. You can reach us, our voicemail box at area code 314-298-6649. Well, that's about the end of the show, Steve. I want to thank you for stopping by and discussing the African Americans for Humanism. Very interesting program, and I invite our viewers to tune in again next week for Free Thinking 101. I'm Pat Inniss. Good night.